My husband slapped me because I served myself dinner before filling his plate. He thought I would apologize like I always had. Instead, I quietly packed my children's bags, walked out that same night, and took a secret with me that would destroy everything he believed he owned. Please stick with me, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. My name is Maren Holt, and for 12 years I convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than defending my own dignity. My husband, Gage Holt, made every decision in our house, from how money was spent to who spoke during family gatherings. I kept telling myself I was staying for our 2 children, Nina and Owen, believing they needed both parents under one roof. Looking back, I realized they needed a safe home more than a complete one. The slap over something as small as serving myself dinner wasn't the beginning of my suffering. It was the moment that finally opened my eyes. When I looked at my children's frightened faces, I knew I couldn't allow them to grow up believing that love meant fear or that respect had to be earned through silence. After everyone went to bed, I packed a few bags, lifted my sleeping children into the car, grabbed my keys, and drove away without leaving a note. I had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, I knew I was finally choosing freedom instead of fear. I'd expand this outline into a smooth 250-word narrative while keeping the story flowing naturally. As I drove through the quiet streets that night, memories of my marriage kept replaying in my mind. Gage hadn't always been the man who raised his hand against me. When we first married, he was thoughtful, hardworking, and full of plans for our future. Little by little, though, that man disappeared. It started with criticism disguised as advice. He questioned how I cooked, how I dressed, and even how I spoke around his coworkers. Soon he insisted on handling all of our finances, telling me it was easier if one person stayed in charge. Before long, every decision in our home belonged to him, from where we spent holidays to how we raised our children. I stopped sharing my opinions because they were usually dismissed before I could finish speaking. His parents only made things worse. They treated me like someone whose only purpose was to keep Gage comfortable, and if I ever disagreed, they accused me of being an ungrateful wife. Every family gathering reminded me that I would never truly belong. I kept hoping the man I married would come back once the stress of growing his construction company settled down, but success only made him more controlling and distant. The house grew quieter, yet the tension became impossible to ignore. Nina and Owen noticed everything. They became careful with their words, watching their father's mood before speaking. Seeing my children walk on eggshells inside their own home finally forced me to admit the painful truth. They were learning that fear was normal, and I could no longer allow that lesson to shape their future. I'd expand this outline into a smooth 250-word narrative while keeping the story flowing naturally. As I drove through the quiet streets that night, memories of my marriage kept replaying in my mind. Gage hadn't always been the man who raised his hand against me. When we first married, he was thoughtful, hardworking, and full of plans for our future. Little by little, though, that man disappeared. It started with criticism disguised as advice. He questioned how I cooked, how I dressed, and even how I spoke around his coworkers. Soon he insisted on handling all of our finances, telling me it was easier if one person stayed in charge. Before long, every decision in our home belonged to him, from where we spent holidays to how we raised our children. I stopped sharing my opinions because they were usually dismissed before I could finish speaking. His parents only made things worse. They treated me like someone whose only purpose was to keep Gage comfortable, and if I ever disagreed, they accused me of being an ungrateful wife. Every family gathering reminded me that I would never truly belong. I kept hoping the man I married would come back once the stress of growing his construction company settled down, but success only made him more controlling and distant. The house grew quieter, yet the tension became impossible to ignore. Nina and Owen noticed everything. They became careful with their words, watching their father's mood before speaking. Seeing my children walk on eggshells inside their own home finally forced me to admit the painful truth. They were learning that fear was normal, and I could no longer allow that lesson to shape their future. I'd continue the story naturally in about 250 words, keeping the sequence consistent. A few days after I left, Gage still hadn't called to apologize. Instead, he acted as if I were throwing a childish tantrum that would end once I ran out of money or courage. Rather than speaking to me himself, he sent his parents and a few relatives to convince me to come home. They arrived at the motel wearing concerned expressions, but their words quickly revealed their real purpose. They insisted every marriage had arguments and said I was tearing our family apart over what they called one little slap. They reminded me of everything Gage had supposedly provided and suggested I should be grateful instead of stubborn. I listened without interrupting, then calmly told them the slap wasn't the reason I left. It was simply the final moment after years of being criticized, ignored, controlled, and treated like I didn't matter. I explained that respect isn't lost in a single night, it disappears one choice at a time. They had watched it happen for years and never once defended me. There was nothing left to debate. My quiet response seemed to frustrate them more than anger ever could. When they realized they couldn't change my mind, they reported everything back to Gage. He couldn't understand why I wasn't begging him to take me back or trying to fix the marriage. He expected tears, excuses, and promises to do better. Instead, he was met with calm confidence and firm boundaries. For the first time since we'd met, Gage realized he no longer controlled the conversation, and that uncertainty unsettled him more than any argument ever could. I'd expand this into a smooth 250-word continuation while keeping the story realistic and connected. As the days passed, I realized there was one part of my life Gage had never known about. Long before we met, my grandfather had spent countless afternoons teaching me how money could quietly grow when it was managed with patience instead of emotion. He believed financial independence gave people choices, especially during life's hardest moments. When he passed away, he left me a modest inheritance. I never treated it like free money. With the guidance of experienced professionals, I invested it carefully over the years, allowing it to grow through disciplined, long-term decisions. I never mixed those investments with our household finances, and I never used them to interfere with Gage's construction company. I wanted my marriage to stand on trust, not on hidden advantages. While Gage believed his success came entirely from his own efforts, my portfolio continued expanding quietly in the background. Eventually, one of the private investment firms managing part of my assets began purchasing debt from struggling construction businesses as part of its normal investment strategy. I rarely involved myself in day-to-day decisions, but I regularly reviewed the reports. Months before I left home, I noticed something that made me stop reading for a moment. Among those financial records were loans connected to Gage's rapidly growing company. It wasn't something I had arranged or expected. It was simply the result of ordinary business transactions. I never imagined those documents would become important to my personal life. I hadn't planned revenge or hoped for his downfall, but after everything that happened, I knew the truth could no longer remain hidden forever. I'd expand this outline into a natural 250-word continuation that keeps the story moving forward. The moment Gage realized I wasn't coming back, his attitude changed completely. Instead of trying to repair our marriage, he hired one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the city. His strategy was simple. He believed I had no financial resources and would eventually give in under the pressure of expensive legal fees. During our first settlement meeting, his lawyer demanded almost everything. They wanted the family home, primary custody of Nina and Owen, and the majority of our shared assets. They argued that Gage's steady income made him the more suitable parent and hinted that I would struggle to provide a stable future on my own. I listened quietly while my attorney took careful notes. While the divorce moved forward, Gage's business began facing problems he could no longer ignore. Suppliers who had always been patient suddenly demanded payment on overdue invoices before delivering more materials. A bank that had previously approved every request refused to extend additional credit, explaining that it needed to reduce its risk. Gage blamed everything on the slowing economy and convinced himself that every construction company was dealing with the same challenges. He believed the situation was temporary and that another profitable project would solve everything. His accountant, however, wasn't nearly as optimistic. After reviewing the company's financial records, he explained that several major loans had quietly been sold to a new owner months earlier. That meant someone else now had the legal authority to negotiate repayment terms or demand immediate action if the agreements allowed it. The accountant warned Gage that whoever controlled those debts held significant leverage over the future of the company. Instead of taking the warning seriously, Gage assumed a large investment corporation had purchased the loans as part of a routine financial transaction. He spent days trying to guess which firm was behind the change, never considering that the answer was much closer than he imagined. Across the courtroom during every divorce meeting, I listened without revealing what I already knew. My investment portfolio had become connected to those loans through decisions made long before our marriage fell apart. I had never planned to use that position against him, but as his confidence slowly gave way to uncertainty, he remained completely unaware that the woman he had spent years underestimating now held far more influence over his future than he could possibly imagine. The biggest turning point came during one of our mediation sessions. Both legal teams had gathered to review updated financial disclosures before discussing another settlement proposal. Gage walked into the room with the same confidence he had shown since the divorce began. He still believed I would eventually give up and accept whatever terms he offered. As the meeting progressed, my attorney presented additional documents regarding my financial interests and business holdings. One page listed a respected private investment company that officially represented my assets. Gage looked at it, leaned back in his chair, and laughed. He sarcastically suggested that I must have convinced wealthy investors to rescue me because I couldn't survive on my own. His attorney remained silent and continued reading. Moments later, another document explained the ownership structure of the investment group. The room grew noticeably quieter as everyone realized I wasn't simply a client. I was the principal owner behind the firm. The portfolio included millions of dollars in commercial debt, among them several obligations connected directly to Gage's construction business. His smile disappeared instantly. He grabbed the paperwork and read it again, convinced he had misunderstood something. Even his attorney looked stunned. For years Gage had dismissed my opinions, believing I knew nothing about business or finance. Now he was forced to confront a reality he had never imagined. The woman he had treated as powerless had quietly built a successful financial future long before our marriage collapsed. No one spoke for several long moments. The balance of power had shifted completely, and Gage finally understood that he had spent years underestimating the person sitting across the table from him. I'd expand this outline into a smooth 250-word continuation while maintaining the story's flow. News of what happened during mediation spread through Gage's family much faster than I expected. Within days, the same people who had blamed me for ruining the marriage suddenly wanted to meet. His parents called repeatedly before showing up at my attorney's office, asking for just a few minutes to talk. Their voices were softer than I had ever heard, and their harsh criticism had been replaced with polite smiles. They insisted they had always considered me part of the family and said divorce would only hurt everyone involved. They spoke about forgiveness, second chances, and keeping the family together for Nina and Owen. As I listened, it became painfully clear why their attitude had changed so quickly. They had learned that Gage's construction company depended on financial agreements connected to the investment firm I owned. If the business collapsed, it wouldn't only affect Gage. It could threaten the income and financial security of several members of the family who relied on him. When they finally asked me to reconsider the divorce, I calmly reminded them of every time they watched Gage belittle me without saying a word. I asked where their concern had been when I was constantly criticized, ignored, and treated as though my feelings didn't matter. They lowered their eyes because they knew the answer. I told them I wasn't ending my marriage over money or revenge. I was ending it because respect had disappeared long before I packed my bags. Their sudden kindness wasn't about protecting our family. It was about protecting their finances, and there was a difference they could no longer hide. After my conversation with Gage's parents, I made a promise to myself that I would never allow the divorce to become my children's burden. Whatever happened between their father and me was an adult problem, and Nina and Owen deserved the chance to grow up without carrying that weight. Instead of paying attention to the rumors surrounding Gage's business, I focused on helping the kids adjust to their new life. I found an experienced counselor who specialized in helping children through family separation, and week by week I saw small but meaningful changes. They laughed more easily, slept through the night, and no longer looked nervous every time someone raised their voice. We rented a modest home that wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. We cooked dinner together, watched movies on weekends, and slowly created new routines that made the house feel warm and secure. Although I had every reason to be angry with Gage, I refused to insult him in front of the children. Whenever they asked questions about their father, I answered honestly without filling their hearts with bitterness. I wanted them to build their own opinions based on their experiences, not on my pain. The court battle continued in the background, but I protected them from every legal argument and financial dispute. My purpose had never been to punish my children by taking away their father. It was to give them something they had been missing for years, a home where they could feel safe, respected, and loved without fear. Watching them smile again reminded me that leaving had been the right decision from the very beginning. As the weeks passed, the pressure surrounding Gage's company continued to grow. More creditors demanded payment, deadlines became impossible to ignore, and every failed negotiation pushed his business closer to serious financial trouble. For the first time since I had known him, he looked like a man who understood he couldn't solve every problem through confidence alone. One afternoon, he asked if we could meet without our attorneys present. I agreed, curious to hear what he wanted to say. When he sat across from me, the arrogance that had once defined him was gone. He apologized for the years of criticism, for controlling every part of our marriage, and for the slap that finally drove me away. He admitted he had taken me for granted and never imagined I would actually leave. I listened carefully without interrupting. His words sounded sincere, and I believed he truly regretted many of his decisions. Still, something became painfully clear as the conversation continued. He had not apologized the night he frightened our children. He had not apologized when I walked away with nothing but a few bags. He apologized only after losing control of both his family and his business. That difference mattered more than he realized. I thanked him for accepting responsibility because hearing the truth was better than hearing excuses. But I also told him that forgiveness did not mean rebuilding a marriage that had been shaped by fear, silence, and control. Some broken things can be repaired, but trust cannot return simply because circumstances change. I wished him peace for the future, then quietly stood up and walked away, knowing my decision would remain unchanged. I'd continue the story in about 250 words, keeping the flow natural and consistent. The final negotiation took place a few weeks later. By then, everyone involved understood that continuing the legal fight would only create more damage. My attorney and I presented a proposal that had taken days to prepare. It held Gage responsible for his financial obligations while protecting the people who had done nothing wrong. His construction company employed dozens of hardworking men and women who depended on their paychecks to support their own families. I refused to let innocent people lose their livelihoods simply because my marriage had fallen apart. The agreement restructured the outstanding debt, gave the business a realistic repayment schedule, and required Gage to give up certain assets and management privileges until those obligations were met. It also ensured that our children would be financially supported without becoming part of another courtroom battle. Gage reviewed every page slowly. His attorney whispered advice, but there were very few alternatives left. Rejecting the offer would likely push the company into even greater financial trouble, hurting everyone connected to it. After several long minutes, he picked up his pen and signed the documents. I could see the frustration in his eyes, not because the agreement was unfair, but because he could no longer bend the situation to his will. For years he had believed every problem could be solved if he pushed hard enough or refused to compromise. This time, the consequences of his own choices had finally caught up with him. I wasn't celebrating his defeat or seeking revenge. I simply wanted accountability, fairness, and the chance to close this painful chapter with my dignity and conscience still intact. I'd continue the story naturally in about 250 words while keeping the sequence consistent. Several months after the divorce was finalized, life finally settled into a peaceful routine. I bought a modest house with a small backyard where Nina and Owen could play without hearing raised voices or feeling the need to hide in their rooms. It wasn't the biggest home I had ever lived in, but it quickly became the happiest. Slowly, I watched my children become themselves again. They laughed more freely, invited friends over after school, and slept through the night without waking from bad dreams. Dinner became my favorite part of the day because we could sit together, share stories, and enjoy a meal without worrying about someone's mood changing the entire evening. Those simple moments reminded me that peace was worth far more than appearances or expensive possessions. At the same time, I quietly continued expanding my investment work. Rather than looking for ways to profit from struggling businesses, I focused on helping companies recover through fair agreements and responsible financial planning. I knew what it felt like to lose hope, and I didn't want honest employees to suffer because of poor leadership at the top. My reputation grew through trust instead of publicity, and that was enough for me. Looking back, I realized how much I had changed. There was a time when I wanted people to admit they had underestimated me. Now, I no longer needed anyone's approval. My confidence came from knowing exactly who I was and what I had overcome. I had built a peaceful life for my children and myself, and no one could ever take that away from us again. I'd continue the story in about 250 words, keeping it consistent with the previous outline. From time to time, Gage saw glimpses of our new life during scheduled visits with Nina and Owen. The children arrived smiling, eager to tell him about school, new friends, and the little traditions we had created in our home. They were no longer nervous or quiet the way they had been before. Watching them grow more confident forced him to face a truth he had spent years avoiding. Our marriage had not ended because of a single slap at the dinner table. That painful moment had only exposed years of disrespect, control, and emotional distance that had slowly broken the foundation of our family. Looking back, he began to recognize countless opportunities when he could have chosen kindness instead of pride. He understood that every insult, every decision made without my voice, and every time he dismissed my feelings had pushed us further apart. By the time he realized what he had destroyed, there was nothing left to repair. His business eventually stabilized under the new financial agreement, but success no longer brought him the satisfaction it once had. The large house felt empty, and the quiet evenings reminded him of everything money could never replace. He had spent years believing authority was the same as respect, only to discover that genuine love cannot survive where one person demands control over another. That lesson arrived far too late. I never celebrated his regret because it couldn't erase the past. Instead, I hoped he would become a better father for our children than he had been as a husband. Sometimes the greatest consequence isn't losing wealth, it's realizing you lost the people who mattered most through your own choices. A year after I walked away, I sat in the audience at Nina's school celebration, surrounded by neighbors who had become true friends and people who knew me for who I was instead of what they expected me to be. As the program ended, Nina and Owen ran toward me with bright smiles and proudly introduced me to their teachers and classmates. There was no fear in their voices, no hesitation in their eyes, only the confidence that comes from growing up in a home filled with love and respect. Watching them, I realized how much our lives had changed in just 1 year. For a long time, I believed the argument over dinner had destroyed my marriage. Looking back, I finally understood that serving myself first had never been the real issue. It simply revealed a painful truth I had ignored for far too long. A healthy relationship should never depend on silence, fear, or obedience. Leaving with my children was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it also became the most important one. I didn't measure my victory by Gage's losses or by the financial position I held. Real success came from giving Nina and Owen a childhood where they felt safe to laugh, speak freely, and believe in their own worth. If my story teaches anything, I hope it's this: never confuse endurance with love or control with respect. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from what is familiar to protect what truly matters. The chapter that began with one painful slap ended with freedom, dignity, hope, and a future built on courage instead of fear.